I put 3 resin sealing methods to the test, and one of them had a variation to it which I didn't actually think of at first, and that ended up saving me a ton of time. However, it turned out that one of these was much better, much quicker, and it gave better results as well. Now, instead of testing high-end resins and sealers on a variety of different woods, I'm going to flip the script. And this is what we are using. A very cheap epoxy resin that I got from Aldi, a regular clear coat spray paint, and some sanding sealer. To compare each method, I have marked and engraved each sample like this using a letter S. I figured the shape of this letter pretty much crosses the grain in every direction imaginable, so that should give us a good result to see if this is going to work. If I can make this work using budget materials like these, then in theory, if you use anything better than this, you should be able to get better results as well. To seal this engraving, I'm simply brushing the epoxy on, making sure to get into all the corners all the way around. The spray paint is an easy one, and I ended up doing 2 coats, basically just spraying it from different angles. The sanding sealer is pretty much the same deal as with the epoxy. You just brush that on and just make sure you get it into all the corners. And it was at this point where I thought to myself, you know what, this epoxy is going to take a long time to dry before I can actually do anything with it. So how about we do a comparison within the comparison, and let's compare using epoxy resin with UV resin. Because as you know, UV resin dries a lot quicker under a UV light. So this UV resin actually comes from Temu. So as you can imagine, really affordable, really cheap stuff. And the nice thing about this is there's no mixing required. So straight out of the bottle, brush it on, put it under the UV light, and a couple of minutes later, Bob's your uncle. All right, so I'm going to try and hold this up so it's still in focus. And this is what we are looking at. So on this side, you can see where the grain runs this way across the wood. We had some epoxy resin seeping into this edge, right over here a little bit as well, and you can see a little bit over there. And obviously this is clear, so you can't see it very well. If it was colored, you definitely see that very, very well. So that's the epoxy resin, and on this side we've got the UV resin, and obviously these lines here, which you see on this edge here, that's not the epoxy, that's actually just part of the wood itself. And actually I can't see any obvious signs of where it might have seeped into the wood, causing any bleeding. So I think that's a thumbs up for this method. If time is of the essence, definitely go with something like a UV resin just to get it sealed. And next, we're going to color fill this and actually see what it looks like. I'm using black for the best contrast, and I tried not to fill these all the way to the top to prevent any epoxy going onto the top of the wood and maybe seep into the grain that way. Unfortunately though, towards the end I did spill a tiny little bit on the corner here, so when we sand this down, we're just going to disregard anything that might show up in that corner. Let's compare the results and run over some pros and cons of each. So what we got here is the epoxy resin on the left and the UV resin on the right. Now at first glance they both look pretty alright, but if we take a closer look at the epoxy resin on the left hand side, you can clearly see that there has been some bleeding around these corners as I've marked them right here. Now, if we take a look at the UV resin on the right-hand side, you can clearly see that this gave us a much better result. Still not 100% perfect, but a lot better than the epoxy resin on the left-hand side. So my final thoughts on the epoxy resin versus the UV resin based on my experience in this comparison. Brushing on the epoxy resin is a time-consuming job. It takes a lot of effort just to go around all the corners and try not to spill anything on its surface. Secondly, it takes a long time to dry, so that's also something to take into consideration, and the results are not that great. So would I use this method? Probably not. On the UV resin side, the brushing also takes a long time, same as with the epoxy resin. It dries very quickly, which is a big plus point, but you do need a UV light to speed up that process. You do get better results, and would I use this one? It depends on the project that I'm working on. If it is a small project like this, I probably would give it a go. The sanding sealer is an interesting one. I honestly did not think this one was going to do as well as it did. If you look at this image here, you can clearly see this is a much better result than either one of the previous two. Now, it's not 100% perfect because you can see in this corner and this corner here, we did have some bleeding, but I'm willing to bet that if I take greater care applying the sanding sealer, that I could probably eliminate those completely. So this is definitely something worth considering. So a quick look at the pros and cons. The brushing takes time, same as with the epoxy resin. But this one dries much quicker, and it gives you a much better result overall than the epoxy resin and the UV resin. And again, would I use this method? Definitely yes. But again, probably on smaller projects like these. Next up is the clear coat spray paint. Now, honestly, I was not expecting anything close to what I got from this one. I've got virtually no bleeding on this whatsoever. How does that compare to the other three methods? Well, this one is very quick and easy to do. It dries the fastest, and it gave me the best results out of all three of these. It does have one downside though, and that is that you do need to cover or mask anything that you do not want to spray. So definitely yes, this is the method that I would recommend, and probably the one that I'm going to stick with for the majority of what I do. Now, what if you just need the top surface sealed for something like a CNC engraving, for example, that you're going to color fill or spray paint afterwards? Well, got you covered on that one too. No pun intended. And you can see more information on that in these videos here. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.